Hi, welcome back to Create, Share, Inspire podcast. This is episode 431, and we're here live in Southwest Florida in my beautiful backyard. If you are joining me live, please say hello. Let me know where you're from. Let me know what you're crafting this evening. Hi, Thea and Lydia and Nikki. Thanks for joining live. Wait a couple minutes for people to pop over from the pre-chat. Hi, Kim. Thanks for joining live. It's super duper hot. Benzie says it's hot in Scandinavia too. Oh boy. Hi Lucy, thanks for joining live. Hi sweet Melissa and Julie, thanks for joining live. Hi Cranjeet, good evening. Hi Nikki. Ooh, little breeze maybe. I think we might be getting a storm too. Would love for you guys to see a tropical thunderstorm. That would be fun. Hi Grammy and Thea and Lydia and Krista. Thanks for joining live. Hi Carol. Hi Pat and Betty, Val. Oh, you're welcome. It's fun to change it up sometimes. I like a little variety too. Hi Joanne from Arkansas. Glad you could be here. Hi Sandpel from Arizona. I've never been to Yuma before. Hi Lisa and Judy. Lydia switched her chores around to join us tonight. Fun. It's fun to switch chores around too sometimes. I just think variety's fun. Spices things up, right? And I had an opportunity to do some step outs today to do a little tutorial for you tonight. And I think a lot of you are going to enjoy it. Hi Grace, thanks for joining. Hi Linda. Hi Anna. Just wait for a few more people to get here. I know it takes a couple minutes for people to pop over from the pre-chat and from the notifications. Hi Millie and Jackie and Stefania and Ola. Glad you all could be here. Hi Mary and Liz and Margaret. Hi Lily, good evening. Hi Healing Springs and Rhonda. Yeah, it looks like people are still coming over from either from notifications or from the pre-chat. Hi Maria, so we'll wait maybe one more minute here to see who else is going to make it tonight. And if you don't make it live, that's okay too. It goes to a recorded version shortly after the live is over, and it's available for people to watch all over the world anytime they possibly want. And that's fun too. Ola's from Jordan, that's cool. Hi Olivia, I've been to Jordan once. Hi Chantel. Julie ate in a flash so she could be here. I didn't eat yet. I'm eating afterwards. Stefania is from Colombia. Wonderful. I have not been there yet. Thanks, Benzie. I love this top. I love the purple, the coral, the red, and the pink all together. It's such a great combination. Hi, Christy. All right, so welcome back to Create, Share, Inspire podcast. This is episode 431, and we're here live in Southwest Florida in my beautiful tropical backyard. And so happy for all of you to join me tonight. I thought that I would do a fun little tutorial for you. I know one of the questions I get asked an awful lot is when you're learning how to crochet and you're working on just plain basic stitches, how do you keep your edges straight? And this is such a common mistake. I had the same problem when I first learned how to crochet, and the quick answer is you need to understand where the stitches are and make sure that you're poking into stitches and that not skipping stitches or adding too many, right? Because what happens is if you don't understand where you're going, you go into extra spots, you increase. And if you skip stitches, you end up decreasing. So a couple of things that I think are really important when you're unsure of all this is to start with swatching. I know sometimes people don't like to hear that, but I'm telling you, if you do something with a short number of stitches in the row where you absolutely know the stitch count I think that's one of the best ways to get practice on getting straight edges, so that you really recognize what that particular stitch looks like at the beginning of a row, in the middle of the row, and at the end of a row, because it does look different in all of those spots. The other thing to keep in mind is, depending on the height of your stitch, you may want to change the number of chains. So if you're doing rows of single crochet, you always do a chain 1 at the beginning of the row, and you never count it as a stitch. So that allows you to only work in stitches and not have to wonder, oh, is that the chain that counts as a stitch, or is that a stitch? You're only working in stitches. Now, the common mistake with that is that sometimes at the end of the next row, you'll see that chain there and assume it's a stitch because you don't recognize the difference between chains and stitches. And when that's the case, having a short number of stitches on your row when you're practicing, you will count as you go and say, hey, I've already got 10. I don't care what that looks like. I've got my 10. I'm going to keep going. Now, when you're practicing taller stitches, this can get even easier in a way, because when they have that vertical texture to them, it's easier to recognize where the stitches are, even if you're still unsure about what's going on at that top of the stitch. The other thing to consider when you're working on taller stitches is what kind of a starting chain or beginning chain you want at the beginning of each row. For example, on a half double crochet, if you chain 1 at the beginning of the row, you don't count it as a stitch and you work into each stitch. And if you do a chain 2, it counts as a stitch, so you chain 2 and skip that first stitch. I think that's the more advanced version when you're trying to learn how to keep your edges straight. So when you're practicing in the beginning, I would do a chain 1 and not count it as a stitch, so that you can start to recognize what that half double crochet looks like at the beginning, middle, and end of your row. So on double crochet, you have the choice of a chain 2 that doesn't count as a stitch, so that you would double crochet right into the first stitch. Or if you use a chain 3 for double crochet, you skip the first stitch. And so what ends up happening is you have to recognize which one's the stitch and which one's the chain, where if you start with the chain 2, I think it gives you a better practice, especially when you've got a small number of stitches. And I'm going to show all this too. I just want to talk about it first. And then on treble crochet, it is a chain 3 at the beginning of the row if you're not counting it as a stitch, and it's a chain 4 at the beginning of the row if you want to count it as a stitch. Now, a lot of times when we do tutorial stuff like this, you would think we're going to start with the smallest stitch first and work our way up to the biggest stitch. But this is one example where I think it will actually make more sense, because of what we're actually talking about, to do the tallest stitch first and then work our way down to the shortest stitch. Because single crochet, I feel like as a beginner, is harder to recognize, even though it's easier to crochet a short stitch, and you'd think that the taller stitches are more complicated. As far as practicing your stitches and recognizing the beginning and end of the rows to practice straight edges, I feel like that is somewhat easier on the taller stitches because they're easier to recognize. So, having said that, let's start with the treble crochet version. And let's see, I'm gonna pop the camera down. Actually, I could try, let's see. Does anyone have a problem with it being backwards like this, where I put it up on the camera? Because if I do it like this, and I can still answer questions. Otherwise, if I pop it down and you look at it in my lap, I won't be able to answer the question. So I'm going to wait a second here and see if I can get some feedback, because what I can do is crochet like this. And although you're not going to be learning the stitches per se, this tutorial really isn't about learning the stitches. It's about recognizing what stitches look like. So thanks. This is part of my Be So Sweet crochet hook set. You can get a whole set of these on my website. And we're using size 3.5 millimeter and Be So Baby yarn. This is colorway turquoise. Okay, so this is the swatch of treble crochet, and as you can see, my edges are perfectly smooth, and I'm doing a rows of 10 treble crochets. So like I said, if I'm not going to count my starting chain as a stitch, I'm going to chain 3, and if I'm going to count it as a stitch, I'm going to do chain 4 and skip the first stitch. So I'm not going to do that. I'm going to do chain 3, turn my work. Now we're going to look at those vertical stitches, and this is how it's going to be really easy to recognize where the top of that stitch is. You're going to follow the vertical post of that stitch and look all the way up to the top of it, and you'll see there are 2 bars at the top like a V. Hopefully that's in focus. See those V's? And because we're not counting a chain as a stitch, we're not having to decide whether or not it's a stitch or a chain. We're looking at those V's and knowing they're all stitches. So we're going to yarn over twice. Because we did a chain 3, we're going to crochet right into that first stitch. Yarn over twice, pull up a loop, yarn over, pull through 2, pull through 2, and pull through 2. And I'm going to crochet across this row and then show you how to find that 10th stitch. So we're not counting the chain 3, so we've done 1 stitch, and because we're doing a small swatch here, it's going to be so easy to count our stitches, and if we get the right stitch count at the end of the row, and we've been careful about where we put our stitches, like following that vertical bar. See, I worked that stitch directly over the stitch below. I don't have to question where it's going. And that's where practicing on the taller stitches is going to be super duper helpful for practicing learning how to recognize the beginning and the end of the row. So I'm going to speed along here for a second and maybe look up and see if there's any questions, because the middle of the row is usually not the hard part, especially on the taller stitches. It's the beginning and the end where you can really get confused and either guess incorrectly and add too many, or guess incorrectly and add too little stitches. And either one of those mistakes will give you not straight edges. You'll either have them veer out when you've put too many stitches in there, or veer in when, okay, so now I'm coming to the end of the row here, and it's not quite obvious if there's 1 or 2 stitches left, right? We've kind of got 2 things going on there, but this is when you would go back and count. So we've got our chain 3 that's not counting as a stitch. And we've got 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9 stitches. So if there's only 1 more to go, then I can say, oh yeah, that's why it looks funny. We have our stitch and we have that chain 3 from the beginning of the previous row that doesn't count as a stitch. That's why it looks funky. Now, if I didn't take that extra time to count my stitches and think about where I was, I might mistakenly put 2 stitches there thinking, oh, there's a stitch and there's a stitch. So it's really important to take a step back at the end of the row, go back and count, and think about, and look at your stitches. Do they all line up over the stitches in the previous row? Yes, they do. If you've made a mistake, at this point, if you look closely at it, you can probably tell if they don't line up over the others. And you can see now we have a chain 3 that doesn't count as a stitch, and 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10. Okay, so treble crochet is going to be the easiest version of showing this. And I'll do it on the other stitches as well, and you'll see how it's going to get a little more confusing to do as we go along, which is all the more reason to practice it. Okay, so here's our double crochet swatch, and look at how nice and straight my edges are, and our stitches are going straight up and down on top of each other. So if I'm not going to count the starting chain as a stitch in double crochet, I'm going to do a chain 2 at the beginning of the row. So I'm going to chain 2, turn my work, and not count that as my first stitch. So we've got our first stitch here. We're going to yarn over, insert our hook, yarn over, pull up a loop, yarn over, pull through 2, yarn over, pull through 2. Yep, you have 2 options, Anna, you can do. It ends up being 1 chain less for a chain that doesn't count, and 1 chain more for a chain that does count. And okay, so we'll now work in each stitch across. If you're unsure on these taller stitches, it is helpful to take a look. Like there's our vertical post of the next stitch. So if you follow that vertical post all the way up to the top and look at it, there's a V there, and you want to work into both loops of that V. And if you turn it back to the, front here, you'll see that there is a loop, there is a hole there under that V, and that's where we're going to work, unless you're working in front loop, back loop, and that's a whole other subject. So we're going to follow up that vertical bar of the stitch to the V at the top, yarn over, insert our crochet hook, yarn over, pull up a loop, yarn over, pull through 2, yarn over, pull through 2. So I'm going to do that across the whole row, and then the important thing to show you again is how to recognize that last stitch at the end of the row. Okay, so let me see where I'm at here. So we've got chain 2 that doesn't count, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9. So you can see here at the end of the row, there's, it's, I'm not sure. There's something on the side here of a chain, and then there's the last stitch. So you may wonder, are there 2 stitches left, or are there 1 stitch left? Well, it's pretty easy to count at this point, so we're going to go back to the top. We have our chain 2 that doesn't count as a stitch, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9. All right, so we've got 1 more stitch to go, and we skip that chain 2 next to the last stitch because that was the chain 2 that didn't count as a stitch on the previous row. Okay, so that's how we do it in double crochet. Now, all of this is just slightly different if you're going to count the chain 3 as your first stitch and use it as a stitch, and what will happen is these edges won't be as straight. They will be a little more bumpy, and you can choose that as a design element. You can choose that because you prefer to do it. Sometimes I prefer to do it this way where the chain doesn't count as a stitch because I feel like your edges are that much straighter. Okay, so next we'll do half double crochet, and you'll notice that as you crochet smaller stitches, it ends up being harder to recognize the stitches, which is all the more reason to practice. Okay, so when we're doing a half double crochet and we're not going to count the stitch or the chain as a stitch, we're going to chain 1 at the beginning of the row. If we're going to count the chain as a stitch, we're going to chain 2 at the beginning of the row. So we're going to do a chain 1 and turn our work and half double crochet right into that first stitch. So yarn over, insert your hook, yarn over, pull up a loop, yarn over, pull through all 3 loops on your hook. Now, can you imagine if you did this for 100 rows, how much better you'd get at it? You would start to understand what those stitches look like so much more. The more you practice something, the better you get at it. And this is such a common mistake for beginners that I highly recommend doing it. I mean, if you're worried about wasting it, don't waste it. Use this skinny strip as a headband or a bookmark or a belt or a skinny scarf. There's all different ways that you could use it. If you think it's going to be a waste of your time to do a swatch, then keep going, make it a little longer, and make it something that you can use. Okay, so half double crochet is yarn over, insert your hook, yarn over, pull up a loop, yarn over, pull through 3 loops on your hook. Okay, and so just like before, we're going to try to match up our stitches, over our previous stitches, and work through both loops at the top of the stitch, unless otherwise specified to work through the front loop only or the back loop only. Otherwise, we always work through both loops, and no matter where you work it, you want to be consistent so that the pattern is uniform. Okay, we're getting close to the end here, and we could even be 2 stitches out, and I'm starting to not be sure. So I'm going to count at this point. So we've got our chain 1 that doesn't count as a stitch. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8. Yep, I was right. There's 2 stitches and a chain 1 at the end of this row. Now the chain 1 is less obvious than the chain 2, so that's where it can really sneak up on you, and that's why half double crochet and single crochet is by far the hardest to recognize stitch from chain, and we'll do that one next. So I have 2 stitches left, and you can, if you really pay attention now that we know that, you'll see there are 2 vertical posts. They're shorter now, but there are 2 vertical posts of stitches and then a chain that's kind of slanted on the side. So we'll work into both of those stitches and ignore that slanty chain on the side. And we've got our 10 stitches and we've got our beautifully straight edges. Yeah, a bookmark. If you only want to do this for 6 inches or so, make it, or 8 inches, make it a bookmark. But I still highly recommend doing this type of a practice. And the better you get at recognizing the beginning and edge stitches, the better you are at getting straight edges, the more professional and beautiful your projects look, and the happy you are with all the effort that you've put in. So there is never, ever, ever a bad reason to practice. I mean, whatever you do, the more you practice it, the better you get at it. So don't beat yourself up if your edges are funky. My edges were messed up when I started crocheting too. I'll never forget the first shawl I made. I did it all in single crochet, and I did it widthwise. No, I did it narrowwise. And it had the most awful jagged edges, and it wasn't even like a pattern where I could say it was a scalloped edge. It was a mess, and I had no idea why. So you're not the only one that has this problem. Everybody has this problem in the beginning. And even if you're not a beginner anymore, you might just avoid doing rows of single crochet because of this. Sometimes when we're not good at something, we just avoid it and go on to something else, right? And there's no reason to avoid such a beautiful fabric as rows of single crochet. I think it's one of my favorite fabrics to look at. It is one of the best Zen projects to do rows of single crochet because it's just such a beautiful repetitive motion. But if you don't get straight edges, it can be extremely frustrating. So hopefully this will help. Now on single crochet, it's always a chain one at the beginning of the row, and it never counts as a stitch. So we're ready to start our next row here. And before I do, I'm going to point out that those vertical posts of the stitches are obviously a lot shorter here. And so sometimes it's better to look at the top of the work and look at those V's, because the V's are truly where you are inserting your crochet hook to work this stitch. So sometimes, I'm going to turn it this way towards me to see those V's. I'm going to be constantly turning it back towards myself to make sure I'm working into the right spot. So we're going to chain one, turn your work. Yes, somebody just said treble crochet is relaxing. Actually, whatever stitch you're doing, if you're doing it all by itself, it all makes a beautiful repetitive action and ends up being very Zen-like. So we'll compare all of these fabrics side by side too, and you'll see how beautiful and yet different they all are as well. All right, so single crochet is insert your hook, and we're working right into the first stitch, pull up a loop, yarn over, pull through two. And we're going to do this all the way across the row. And I find it is super easy to recognize where to put my stitch in the middle of the row. You can see the bump, you can see that vertical, you can see the V on the top, you can see the bump facing you, and so it's pretty obvious where to do it. It's at the end of the row that it's going to get confusing because of that chain one sitting next to the single crochet. It looks like another single crochet that's just slightly at an angle. So I'm going to show you so I've done 9 stitches right now, and I'm at my 10th stitch, and it almost looks like there's 2 more stitches, right? So we've got our stitch, and then we've got this weird bump on the side that's not quite a stitch, but if you're guessing and you don't know what you're looking at, you could very easily think that that's a stitch. Oh, the other thing I want to mention, when you're new and practicing this stuff, try to avoid yarns with too much texture. That's where you're not going to be able to see all of these details that I've pointed out today, like where that V is at the top of the stitch. That's easy to recognize on a smooth yarn. When you add a lot of bulk or texture to your yarn, that ends up being harder to recognize. Doesn't mean you can't do it. It just means that it's easier to practice on this before you go to a more advanced texture like that. All right, so we'll single crochet into our last stitch, and now we'll count. And here's where you can mess up too. When counting your stitches, I'm gonna slide that up so I don't lose it. Okay, so this is how the yarn was facing me just now. And if I'm going to count my stitches to make sure I have 10, I'm always going to count back from the last stitch I did We've got 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10. Because if I started counting from this side, I might mistakenly count that slanty, almost stitch that's the chain 1, right? If you started from this side, you say, oh, maybe that's the first stitch. No, that's the first stitch. And that's where you can really get confused because the chain 1 looks like it's almost a stitch. So now let's look at all of these side by side. Uh-oh, did I lose one? Because I think you might enjoy seeing the different textures side by side as well. Okay, so here we have, and man, those edges are really smooth. And that's because I did the shorter chain that doesn't count as a stitch. When you do the larger chain that counts as a stitch, it does give you a less smooth edge. Always has, always will. So I'll remind you of those again. So this is the treble crochet swatch. This is the double crochet swatch. This is the half double crochet swatch. Let's see if I can hold those better. Come on, if you can hold 11 cards for Jen, you can hold 4 swatches. Let's go. I love playing cards so much. Okay, so there's single crochet, half double crochet, and treble crochet. Try to show those side by side again. Oh, I can do it in 2. Let's see, let's do it in 2 hands. That's how we'll do it. Okay, treble crochet, double crochet, half double crochet, and single crochet. Now, as a quick reminder, if you want your starting chain to count as a stitch on treble crochet, it's chain 4 and it counts as your first stitch. So on your return row, you'll have to work your last stitch into that chain 4 that counted as a stitch as well. But if you change that to a chain 3 and it doesn't count as a stitch, it's a lot easier then because you're just crocheting into stitches and you're skipping that smaller chain 3 at the beginning of the row. So for treble crochet, it's chain 4 to count as a stitch or chain 3 to not count as the first stitch. In double crochet, you can tell, I mean, my edges are extremely straight and smooth because I'm not counting the chain as a stitch. In double crochet, it's chain 2 to not count as a stitch and chain 3 if you're going to count it as a stitch. In half double crochet, it's chain 2 if you're going to count it as a stitch and chain 1 if you're not going to count it as a stitch. And in single crochet, it's always chain 1 and it never counts as a stitch. And so going forward to anything taller, okay, so single crochet, chain 1 never counts as a stitch. Half double crochet, it's chain 1 to not count as a stitch and chain 2 to count as a stitch. Double crochet, it's chain 2 to not count as a stitch, chain 3 to count as a stitch. And treble crochet, it's chain 3 to not count as a stitch and chain 4 to count as a stitch. And so going forward, you go up by 1 chain for the next height level of a stitch. So double treble crochet would be chain 5 to count as a stitch and chain 4 to not count as a stitch. So I hope that was extremely helpful to some people. Some of you already know this, but some of you don't. And and if you're in England, then all of this is different as well. So yeah, the height of the stitch is off by 1. You can use whatever kind of crochet hooks that you prefer to use. Everybody has a preference. Sometimes people prefer wood, sometimes people prefer metal, sometimes people prefer plastic. Inline, there's lots of different versions. You just need to try different ones and see what works best for you. There's no wrong answer to that, by the way. There is no wrong answer to what makes you feel comfortable and what makes you feel creative and what gives you the results that you want. So don't let anybody ever tell you you have to use a certain kind. It's what works for you. Oh, somebody is saying they like ergonomic. That's great. And if that works for you, that's wonderful. You're welcome. And the hook can depend on what kind of yarn you're using or what kind of technique you're using as well. I like to use a variety of crochet hooks for a variety of different reasons. Thank you. I'm glad you like my hooks. What way do you turn your work? Okay, which way do I turn my work? Towards the palm of my hand or away? I turn it away. Yep, so when I'm finished with this row, I'm going to chain and I'm going to turn it away from me. So I'm going to turn it clockwise. Now, I would imagine that you could do it either way, but here would be the most important part of that. Whatever choice you make, when you have a choice of doing something in two different ways in a project, make sure you stay consistent within that project, not for the rest of your life. You don't need that kind of commitment. Just stay with whatever choice you're making, be consistent throughout that project so that you don't see any weird things out of pattern. Because what'll happen is the texture may be different when you make different decisions, like whether you work into a chain or work into the space under a chain. Whichever way you go, it's perfectly fine as long as you're just consistent in the project. But that's a good question too. Does anybody have any other questions about that? I didn't melt, yay. It's actually more comfortable now than it is out in the sun in the morning, this time of year. But tomorrow morning we'll be back at 7:45 a.m. Most likely here in my yard, but we'll see what the weather's like. But tomorrow morning will be 7:45 a.m. and it's already scheduled. So if you get notifications already, great. If you don't, you can go to the front page of my YouTube channel and click to get a reminder or set a reminder on your alarm clock, whatever, but we'll be 7:45 a.m. Eastern time zone tomorrow. And so if anybody wants to stick around for another minute or two and pick a number between 1 and 5, I will randomly pick a quote from one of the Create, Share, Inspire notebooks to, we've got number 5 already. All right. Oh, and if everybody would like to congratulate Joe's Web, she is the winner of the yarn giveaway on Wednesday. I did notify her earlier today. I have not heard back from her with her mailing address yet, but as soon as I do, I will mail out her prize. So thank you all so much for participating. That giveaway was a lot of fun. Got lots of great comments to randomly scroll through. I think we had over 200 applicants, so that was fantastic. All right, so we're going to look at Create, Share, Inspire Notebook, Volume 1, Issue 5, and randomly, you can go to my website for all of my yarns and my hooks, whoever's asking that. It's there's a link to it in my video description, or you go to KristinOmdahl.com. Ooh, this is a tough one to follow sometimes. Well, sometimes it's easy and sometimes it's not easy. But anyway, this one's by Robert Louis Stevenson. Keep your fears to yourself, but share your courage with others. This is beautiful. I love it. Sometimes it's hard to keep your fears to yourself. Sometimes I feel like it's good to share with people so they know they're not alone. Other times, I don't think anybody does want to hear about the negative side. But always share your courage with others. I think that setting a good example is so amazing. It's so good for yourself, for you feeling good about yourself, and it's always so, so, so good to set an example for others and to just be courageous for other people, because at any given time, someone may be too weak to stand up for themselves, and it feels pretty darn good to be able to help someone when you feel stronger than they do. I know that's one of my favorite things in the whole world. Anyway, so here's Robert Louis Stevenson. What a tongue twister tonight, and I have no idea why. Keep your fears to yourself, but share your courage with others. Love it. I hope some of you enjoy that too. Maybe it's timely for some of you, and maybe it just feels good, and maybe it's just a good reminder. I think it's a good reminder always to remember to be courageous and be a listener. I see someone else talking about that too. Yes, sometimes it's so good to just learn how to listen to people without giving unsolicited advice. Just listen. Sometimes people just want to be heard. Thank you all so much for taking time out of your busy evening to spend a few minutes here with me. I hope you enjoyed my backyard. I hope you enjoyed the sound of the birds. The kitties were here, but they're too busy sleeping to join us tonight. I hope you enjoyed the tutorial. Hope you gained something from any part of it. I hope you enjoyed chatting with me and everyone else here. Let us make time to create, share, and inspire today and every day. I will see you tomorrow morning at 7:45 a.m. Eastern Time. Have a wonderful evening. Bye-bye.